If you've been looking at the Nintendo Switch eShop upcoming page for the last, my goodness, it feels like years, well, you'll have seen Cris Tales on the ever upcoming list, but finally, it's actually released. I've played it for 26 hours and can confirm it is both a mesmerically beautiful JRPG, but equally frustrating in some areas. I guess the relief will be for those that have pre-ordered it. I think there's enough here for fans of the genre, but certainly we've got quite a bit to go through. Join me for some Cris Tales, my moto, and a couple of why not? Let's find out.
This is gonna change my life.
Narrative then is something that Cris Tales does incredibly well. Not only is every character in the game fully voice acted, the voice acting's decent and the interactions between your party members are memorable and often laugh out loud funny. You play as Cris Bell, who discovers early on that she has some time-bending abilities that allows her to see into the past as well as the future. As you'd expect from any good JRPG, there is a cataclysmic event on the horizon, and it's up to you and a ragtag bunch of nobodies to go and fix it. Interestingly, the side tales and quests might affect the outcome of an entire town, and that's where the time-bending mechanics really come into their own. How many times have you completed side quests thinking, this is pointless, why am I even doing it? But in Cris Tales, you're often given very difficult choices to make, and not only will you be told the outcomes, you'll also be able to look into the future and see it. A lovely little touch. The narrative takes you across a vast globe to many different cities, and you'll pick up many different comrades along your way. Each of them have their own backstories and drives, and there's some surprisingly adult language and themes that might appeal to other grumpy old farts like me.
I wouldn't say no to a date. You know, once this is all over.
You did not just say that to her.
When it comes to gameplay and controls, Cris Tales has promised many things. The blurb states you have the free ability to move between times, and certainly the game has some very interesting mechanics in that regard. Very often your perspective will be split into 3 views: the past, present and future. I won't go into details, but you've got a friend who's a talking frog, and while not available always, there are often times when you can use him to literally hop into the past or future, and once there he can collect items and bring them back or open hidden chests, and I for one have never seen anything quite like it. That being said, I do wish they'd have chosen a rabbit or something, because when he's in his small form, because obviously he's got much younger if he hops into the past, he is incredibly slow. The developers have managed to avoid gimmicks in most areas, and the combat, which is turn-based, offers a number of unique features. While it initially seems quite straightforward, with you choosing your player, selecting which move you do, special or item, you soon realise that the right-hand side of the screen is reserved for the future, so if you use your crystals, you can actually send enemies into their older, more decrepit future selves. And vice versa, if they are on the left of the screen, you can send them into their past, potentially making them baby versions of themselves and much weaker. As you progress into the mid to late stages, you'll unlock new playable characters who allow for you to manipulate the placement of enemies so you can pick them up and move them from side to side, which can be very useful. Sometimes you might send an enemy into the future only to discover that they are way more powerful then, but they just won't move. You can also manipulate this time aspect by, for example, placing an item that has a delay of a few turns, but then pushing that enemy into the future and having that instantly explode or damage them. It incorporates an entirely new aspect that once again has never been seen before in a JRPG to my knowledge. One aspect I wasn't too keen on though was how old school they went with the way combat starts. You don't see enemies around the map, you simply have random encounters take place, and combined with one technical hiccup on the Switch, this became a real chore for me, and that's the load times. It could take around about 15, maybe 17 seconds to load into combat. And then, for example, if you're planning on just fleeing from combat, you've then got that same wait again and could potentially spend 30 seconds of loading screens for absolutely nothing. It isn't a game where you have to do a huge amount of grinding either, so I don't understand why they didn't opt for a system where you could see either the enemy or you got a choice whether you entered the combat instance. In the middle of the game, you unlock the ability to send items to different stages so you could move them back to when they were first built or push them into the future where they may be crumpled and gone. But this mechanic is used for puzzling, and sometimes you'll need to move around the map to see where it's required, but then obviously have to backtrack and when those random encounters keep interrupting, I just found it very frustrating and a real contrast to the otherwise enjoyable combat. It is worth mentioning that not all areas have this. Each character in your party has an equipment loadout. You can apply different rings, pieces of armor, and each town or city you'll visit will have a shop where you can upgrade your equipment. But you won't find lots of different types of weapon. You'll simply gradually improve the one you've got, but their attributes can also be tweaked and improved by applying direct upgrades to them, which can drastically change them, including adding status effects or just massively boosting the damage. As I'm sure you'd hope, there are a number of boss fights, and as I already alluded to, you don't really feel like you have to grind to beat these. And it's certainly a game where by the end you've got such a powerful party you can cut through most enemies and bosses quite easily. I quite like that. I understand the need to scale enemies to make you feel like you're not completely overpowered, but old school Final Fantasy fans like myself enjoy that feeling of power. And while no, I haven't got an Ultima spell, some of the movesets of these characters are great, such as one who throws random objects from her bag, including a chicken, and a robot who seems to have worked on the 100-hand slap. The world is filled with numerous save locations, and there's also a tent system allowing your party to camp and rest, which will recoup your HP, MP and CP, and Christabel will need that CP to manipulate time during combat. The final aspect to the combat system, which I do really like, is that it requires the player to use their own timing. We've seen something similar in the Trails series, whereby you have to press the button just as your attack lands to do critical damage. And on the flip side of this, if you press that same A button as an attack's received, you'll then parry or reduce entirely its impact. The world in Cris Tales is lovely. There's an overworld map area, very reminiscent to old Final Fantasy titles, and in what might be the most unique method of travel ever, you'll be rowing around in a giant shoe, but not having any map was a puzzling choice. It's not a game where you'll often get lost, but that map could have had the names of the different areas, so for example when it says head back to Wilhelm's house, a quick check and you'd know where you're going. That's not the case, and it's just a very strange and odd omission. That extends to the side questing. There's a quest log, and you can hold the Y button down to see what the next main objective is, but some small quality of life improvements could be made. If I'm asked to go and speak to a specific character, having an exclamation mark above their head is just standard, and when there are so many different people for you to come into contact with and each of them having their own lines of dialogue, you'll have a few head-scratching moments where you're just wandering around towns trying to find that one person. It's not the end of the world, but just something to consider. Now, I mentioned in the story segment that you'll have a number of choices to make. It's surprising what an impact it has on the gameplay, just being able to see into the future on the right hand side of the screen when that's available, and making those difficult choices to restore one house but leave the other actually gave me pangs of guilt as I moved on rowing in my giant glass shoe. I guess in many ways gameplay is very traditional JRPG, and if you're a fan of random combat, as I know actually many people are, you're not going to have any issues here. The turn-based system's unique enough, and there are lots of different enemies to fight, each with their own abilities and weaknesses. The controls are straightforward enough. I would have liked to have had a slightly faster run button, as she seems to move at just a little bit too slow for my liking, but most of the actions in the world are simply performed with a one-button push, or pressing X to send your frog hopping through time. Gameplay scores 16 out of 20, and controls score 18 out of 20. Let's look then at visuals, performance and audio, and this is a really important area for the Nintendo Switch version. It looks to me the reason it was delayed so long is that the developers have tried really hard to eradicate 1, lots of bugs, and 2, some performance problems. Overall, the bugs are minimal, but I have experienced a couple that I should mention. First, and I can't show it on the screen, was a flashing bug. I only had it once, and the developers are absolutely on the case, and it's not something they experienced in any of their testing. The next area is performance. It's generally very good, especially when you consider that there are 3 renderings taking place all at the same time, the screen being split into those triangular areas. It will sometimes dip below 30, but for the vast majority you're looking at 30 FPS, and it also looks to my eye like the developer have gone for native or near native resolution. The image is very crisp, and this visual quality extends to handheld mode. Where Cris Tales shines though is in some of the most beautiful artistic direction I've ever seen in a game. It's a jaw-droppingly stunning experience. And my first hour or two I was gobsmacked by how good this game looks. It combines 3D with 2D elements, parallax scrolling, and a mix mash of effects to trick the player, but actually there's so much going on here. The use of colour is outstanding, the character design's equally impressive, and as subjective as art is, I think it would take a very tough critic not to agree that this game looks amazing. Visuals and performance combined though on the Switch version, especially with those longer load times, brings that down to 16 out of 20. If performance was perfect and the load times were shorter, we'd be looking at a 20 out of 20 here in my opinion. The audio is almost as good as the artwork.
Sweetie, I don't think you understand me in the slightest.
Every character in the game is voice acted. You could find the most obscure NPC in the world and they'll have something to say and it will be well scripted. It's such a change and such a nice update from some of the JRPGs of old. The actors themselves have done a really good job as well. By default, I did find the music a little overpowering. As nice as it is, it's just a touch too loud. However, you can tweak that to your own taste. You can actually disable the voice acting. That might sound slightly strange after what I've just said, but everything down to certain UI elements are voice acted as well, and just having the option there is welcome. Overall though, I think audio is brilliant, and it scores 19 out of 20. Cris Tales is a very respectable £34.99 for anywhere from 30 to 45 hours of gameplay. There is some filler here, some backtracking, and a few issues that irritate me, but overall I think that's a really good asking price, and most JRPG fans are going to feel like they're getting their money's worth. It does succumb to filler at times, but generally the experience ticks along at a reasonable pace with some brilliant narration. I give value 18 out of 20. Cris Tales bases itself on some of my favourite games of all time. Unfortunately, it emulates some of their flaws, but it also does so much new and with its own flair that it's become a game I've thoroughly enjoyed. The characterization's on point and it has its own entirely unique art style. It gets a SwitchUp score of 87%. So there we have it. Do take into account what I've said about the irritation of random battles, because if that's something that really grates on you, you might want to hold off for a performance patch that improves those load times. For everyone else though, crack on, there's more than enough here. I'm glad I took the time to really bust through it, although I feel slightly unwell right now. Let me know in the comments what you think of this one, and a big thanks for watching. For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!